The clatter of cheap ceramic on faux marble was the soundtrack to Ilara Vance's life. At 22, she felt like a ghost haunting the aisles of the Viridian, a downtown diner that tried to mask its greasy spoon soul with potted ferns and an overpriced wine list. She moved through the world with a practiced smile that never quite warmed her tired, intelligent eyes the color of moss after a long rain, a direct inheritance from a mother she missed, with an ache that was a constant, physical presence. For 6 months, since her mother Isabella's passing, Ilara's world had shrunk to the 4 blocks between the diner and the small, rent-controlled apartment she shared with her ailing grandmother. Her dreams of completing her history degree, of a life spent in dusty archives instead of wiping down sticky tables, were locked away, gathering dust alongside her textbooks. Now, life was a relentless cycle of balancing her grandmother's mounting medical bills against their dwindling savings, a battle fought one lukewarm coffee and one pitying tip at a time. But one customer was a storm that rolled in every Tuesday and Thursday at precisely 12:30 p.m., casting a pall over the entire establishment. His name was Julian Croft. He was a titan of real estate development, a man whose name was etched in steel and glass across the city's skyline. His fortune was legendary, but it was his cruelty that was truly breathtaking. His words were scalpels, his gaze a final, damning judgment. Each meal he took at the Viridian was a masterclass in psychological warfare, and Ilara was his favorite battlefield. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly fathom, was that this man, this architect of her daily misery, was bound to her by a secret born from a passionate love affair and sealed by a heartbreaking betrayal over 2 decades ago. This is not merely a story of a waitress and a billionaire. It is the story of a promise broken, a truth buried under layers of ambition and time, and the inevitable, violent collision of 2 worlds that will either shatter them completely or unearth the unbelievable identity of the father she never knew. "Incoming," Leo muttered, sliding a tray of glasses onto the service counter. He was Ilara's only ally in this linoleum jungle, his easy grin a small shield against the daily onslaught. "Table 4, the Prince of Darkness requests your presence." Ilara's shoulders tightened instinctively. She didn't need to look. She could feel the shift in the room's atmosphere, the way the ambient chatter seemed to dip, the way the other servers suddenly found reasons to be in the kitchen. Julian Croft's presence was a low-pressure system, sucking the warmth out of the air. "A thriller minute," she said, her voice a dry whisper. She tightened the knot on her apron, a futile gesture of armoring herself, and grabbed a menu and a water carafe. He sat alone, as always, a stark figure of immense wealth in a place that catered to lunch special mediocrity. His suit was a dark, elegant grey, tailored so perfectly it seemed to be a part of him, an extension of his own rigid control. It probably cost more than her grandmother's last 3 hospital visits combined. He wasn't looking at the menu. He was staring at the building across the street, his face a mask of cold, calculating assessment. He was handsome in a severe, predatory way, sharp, aristocratic features, eyes the color of a frozen lake, and dark hair just beginning to show distinguished threads of silver at the temples. But there was no softness to him, only an unnerving stillness, the coiled energy of a panther watching its prey. "Good afternoon, Mr. Croft. Welcome back," Ilara said, her voice a carefully calibrated instrument of professional neutrality. He did not turn his head. His eyes remained fixed on the brick facade opposite them. "Black coffee. The water from the carafe on your tray is, I can already tell, tepid. Bring me a glass of ice, separately." The cubes must be whole, not the chipped refuse from the bottom of the machine. I will pour the coffee over it myself. Of course, sir. It was his opening salvo, a test of her memory and her willingness to submit to his absurdly specific demands. She had long ago learned that arguing was pointless. It only seemed to amuse him. She returned moments later, the coffee steaming in a thick mug, a separate glass filled with perfect, clear ice cubes. She placed them on the table with a steady hand, her movements economical and precise. Only then did he deign to look at her. His icy blue eyes swept over her, a flick of a glance that was less about seeing her and more about confirming her existence as a functional object. It was a look that said, "You are a pair of hands, a voice, a temporary convenience." He poured the hot coffee over the ice, the cubes cracking with a series of sharp reports. He took a sip, his expression unchanging. "Adequate," he pronounced, the word landing like a crumb of begrudging approval. The steak sandwich. The bread is to be toasted, but not so much that it shatters upon contact. The meat, medium rare. A true medium rare, with a cool red center. If I see even a hint of grey, it will be returned. The onions must be caramelized, not merely sweated. There is a significant chemical difference. Steak sandwich, specific toast, true medium rare, caramelized onions, she recited, the words tasting like metal in her mouth. Excellent choice. She retreated to the point-of-sale system, her fingers tapping the screen with more force than necessary. Leo sidled up beside her. "Did he specify the molecular structure of the bread this time?" he whispered. "He mentioned the chemical difference between sweating and caramelizing an onion." She sighed, leaning her forehead against the cool screen for a second. "Some days, Leo, I feel like he's trying to see what it will take to make me break." "He does that to everyone, Ellie. It's his hobby. He probably goes home and writes in his journal, 'Made a waitress question her life choices today. It was a good day.'" But Leo was wrong. It felt more personal than that. It was the way his gaze seemed to bypass her uniform and her smile and dig into the most insecure parts of her soul. It was a stark reminder of her powerlessness, of her station in life. Her mother, Isabella, had always been her champion, the one who told her she was more than her circumstances, that her mind was a treasure, that her heart was strong. "Non ti arrendere, tesoro mio," she would say, her voice warm and melodic. "Never surrender, my treasure." Without that voice, the world felt colder, and Julian Croft was the avatar of that coldness. The order was up. Ilara inspected the plate herself, cutting a tiny, invisible slit in the side of the sandwich to check the meat. It was perfect. The onions were a deep, glossy brown. The bread was golden. She carried it to him, a peace offering to a hostile god. "Your sandwich, Mr. Croft." He did not thank her. He picked up his knife and fork. He always used a knife and fork for his sandwich, another small affectation of superiority, and sliced it neatly in half. He scrutinized the cross-section like a geologist examining a core sample. He took a bite, chewing with slow, deliberate precision. Ilara found herself holding her breath. "The meat is cooked correctly," he stated, a minor miracle. He then used his fork to isolate a single sliver of caramelized onion. He held it up to the light. "But this is a travesty." Ilara stared at the minuscule piece of onion. "Sir?" "This is what happens when the pan is too crowded," he said, his voice taking on the didactic tone of a disappointed professor. "The onions steam instead of searing. They become soft and sweet, yes, but they lack the slightly bitter, complex notes of a true caramelization. It's a lazy shortcut." For a wild, fleeting moment, Elara pictured herself taking the plate and smashing it on the floor. The image was so vivid, so satisfying, that a tiny smile touched her lips before she could stop it. His eyes narrowed. "Do you find my culinary standards amusing?" "No, sir," she said quickly, her professional mask snapping back into place. "I apologize. I can have the kitchen remake it for you." "Don't be absurd," he waved a dismissive hand. "I don't have time for another attempt. Just inform your chef that his methods are lacking." He ate the rest of the sandwich in a punishing silence. When he was finished, he pushed the plate to the edge of the table and placed his black, featureless credit card on top. She ran the card and brought back the slip. He took a ridiculously expensive fountain pen from his breast pocket and made a great show of signing his name. He stood, adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, and walked out without a word. Elara approached the table, a familiar knot of dread in her stomach. His tips were his final act of cruelty. Sometimes a few coins, once a crumpled dollar bill. She picked up the merchant copy of the receipt. The total was $28.50. On the tip line, he had drawn a bold, definitive 0, and underneath, in sharp, aggressive handwriting, were 2 words: "Be better." The paper felt like it was burning her fingers. It wasn't about the money. It was the judgment, the casual, damning verdict on her effort, her existence. A hot, angry tear pricked the corner of her eye, and she dashed it away, crushing the receipt in her fist. Leo came to clear the table. "Don't even look at it, Ellie. Just throw it away." But she couldn't. She smoothed the crumpled paper out on the service counter and stared at the 2 words. Be better. A silent vow formed in the bruised and battered corners of her heart. One day, she thought, a fierce, desperate prayer. I will be someone you can't dismiss. I will be somewhere you can't touch me. She had no idea that Julian Croft was already closer to her than anyone on earth, bound to her by a past she couldn't remember and a love story he had forced himself to forget. The grim ritual of Julian Croft's visits continued, a bi-weekly exercise in endurance. Elara developed a coping mechanism, a sort of mental armor. She would retreat into the quiet, academic corners of her mind, mentally reciting dates and facts from the history books she no longer had time to read. As he detailed the failings of his soup, she would be silently cataloguing the architectural styles of the buildings outside the window. It was a small act of rebellion, a way of preserving a part of herself that he couldn't touch. One dreary November afternoon, he was in a particularly foul mood. He complained that the faint scent of bleach from the recently mopped floor was assaulting his senses and ruining his palate. He sent back his coffee because the mug had a minuscule chip on the rim, claiming it was a harbinger of systemic carelessness. Each complaint was a carefully placed stone, building a wall of disdain between them. The final note on his receipt that day was the most cutting yet. Competence is a choice. That evening, walking home under the sickly orange glow of the streetlights, his words felt like shards of glass in her mind. They hit at the very heart of her insecurities. Was she competent? She was a university dropout, a full-time waitress, a part-time caregiver. Her life felt like a collection of unfinished sentences. His words weren't just an insult, they felt like a confirmation of her deepest fears about herself. She let herself into the quiet apartment. Her grandmother, Mrs. Gable, was asleep in her room. The soft, rhythmic hiss of her oxygen machine, a constant, worrying presence. The apartment was filled with the ghosts of her mother. Isabella's scent still clung to the worn armchair. Her half-finished crossword puzzle was still on the side table. Tonight, the grief was a heavy cloak. Elara needed to feel her mother's presence, not just the absence she left behind. On a sudden impulse, She pulled the small stepladder from the kitchen closet and climbed up to the highest shelf. There, tucked away behind a stack of old blankets, was a heavy, sealed cardboard box. Isabella had called it her box of before. It held the life she'd had before Ilara, a life she had spoken of only in vague, sad whispers. "Some histories are best left unread, tesoro mio," she'd said once, when a 10-year-old Ilara had asked about her father. "Our story starts with you." Ilara had respected that boundary, even after her mother was gone. But tonight, Julian Croft's cruelty had scraped her soul raw. She needed to know the story that came before. She needed to know the woman her mother had been before she was just a mother. She heaved the box down and set it on the living room floor. With a kitchen knife, she sliced through the brittle packing tape. The air filled with the scent of old paper and dried lavender. Inside, nestled in yellowed tissue paper, was a life. There were photographs of a young, vibrant Isabella, her dark hair a wild mane, her smile radiant. She was standing on a picket line, holding a sign that read, "Preserve our past." In another she was laughing, covered in paint, in what looked like an artist's studio. She was so full of fire, so alive. Then Ilara saw him. A young man stood beside her mother in several photos. He was intense, his jaw set with a fierce determination. But when he looked at Isabella, his expression softened into something achingly tender. He wasn't handsome in the conventional, polished way Julian Croft was now. He was raw, hungry, his eyes burning with an ambition that seemed to leap from the photograph. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. Who was this man? Her mother had never mentioned him. She dug deeper into the box. There was a bundle of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. His letters. The handwriting was sharp, angular, surprisingly familiar. They were passionate, filled with grand plans and declarations of love. He called Isabella his true north, the one who kept him centered, who reminded him what he was fighting for. At the very bottom of the box, wrapped in a piece of velvet, was a small, heavy object. It was a vintage brass compass. It was beautiful, the brass worn to a soft patina. On the back, an inscription was etched in that same sharp script. For Isabella, my true north, J. Ilara's fingers trembled as she held it. This was the man her mother had loved. The man who must be her father. J. A cold dread, slick and oily, began to creep up her spine. The sharp cheekbones, the intense eyes, the set of his jaw. It was impossible. It was a nightmare her exhausted mind was conjuring. Her hands shaking violently, she pulled out her phone. She took a photo of the clearest picture of the young man. And then, with a sense of sickening premonition, she typed Julian Croft Young into the search bar. The screen filled with images. An article from a business journal published 25 years ago appeared at the top. Julian Croft, the young Turk of real estate, shakes up the old guard. The accompanying photo was of a young man in his early 20s, accepting an award. He was wearing a suit, his hair was shorter, but it was him. Unmistakably. The same piercing eyes, the same jawline, the same man who had loved her mother, the same man who treated her like something he'd scraped off his shoe. The phone slipped from her grasp and clattered onto the wooden floor. The compass in her palm suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. J. Julian. The world tilted, the air thinning until she couldn't breathe. Julian Croft, the monster from Table 4, the architect of her daily humiliation, the man she despised with a purity that frightened her. She scrambled for the letters, her mind a maelstrom of horror and disbelief. She tore through them, searching for the story of how it all went wrong. The last letter told the tale. It was dated a year after the first, the tone starkly different. Isabella, it began with none of the previous warmth. My path is set, and it is a narrow one. It requires a singular focus that I cannot maintain, while also distracted. What we had was real, but it belongs to a part of my life I must now put behind me. I am moving to the West Coast to oversee the first major Croft development. Sentiment is a luxury I can no longer afford. I hope you will understand. It was a dismissal, a corporate severing of a human connection. He had called her mother, his true north, a distraction. Elara checked the date on the letter. It was from late May, 23 years ago. Her birthday was in February. 9 months, almost to the day. Her mother must have found out she was pregnant right after he left, and she had never told him. She had chosen to raise a child alone rather than be a distraction to the man she loved. She had protected Elara from him, from his cold ambition, from the man who would trade love for a skyscraper. A wave of nausea washed over her. The questions were a flood, a torrent that threatened to drown her. What kind of man does that? What kind of man becomes him? And the most terrifying question, the one that screamed in the sudden, roaring silence of her apartment, was this my fault? Did my existence turn him into a monster? No. That was a child's fear. The truth was worse. The monster was already there. He had just been better at hiding it. She sat on the floor, surrounded by the wreckage of her mother's hidden past. The pure, simple hatred she had felt for Julian Croft was now a tangled, venomous knot of confusion, betrayal, and a deep, sorrowful grief for the father she never had, and the mother she now understood on a level of sacrifice she could barely comprehend. Her small, difficult life had just been shattered, and at the epicenter of the explosion was the cruel, handsome face of the man she had to serve in less than 12 hours. Sleep was a battlefield of fractured images, her mother's laughing face from the photographs, melting into the cold sneer of Julian Croft, the brass compass in her hand, spinning wildly, its needle unable to find north. His voice, over and over, not from the letters but from the diner. Be better. Competence is a choice. She woke up feeling hollowed out, the chilling reality of her discovery having settled deep into her marrow. He was her father. The words were a blasphemy. A father was meant to be a protector, a guide. Julian Croft was a tormentor. The distance between the passionate young man who wrote those letters and the callous tycoon who critiqued her service was a chasm too wide to see across. Her first instinct was to vanish, quit her job, take her grandmother, and run to a place where the name Croft meant nothing. But the practicalities of her life were a cage. Her grandmother needed stable care. They couldn't afford to move. She was trapped. So she went to work. The diner, once just a place of employment, now felt like a stage set for a Greek tragedy. Every surface seemed to mock her with the secret knowledge she now carried. She was no longer just Elara Vance, waitress. She was the unknown, unacknowledged daughter of the city's most ruthless developer. When she walked in, Leo greeted her with a cup of coffee. "Whoa, you look like you wrestled a bear and lost." "Something like that," she murmured, the words catching in her throat. How could she possibly tell him? "Hey, Leo, you know that sociopath at table 4? Turns out he's my dad." The secret was a living thing, a toxic bloom in her chest. To speak it would be to give it power. She moved through the morning rush in a fugue state. She was an automaton, her body performing the familiar tasks while her mind raced, rereading the letters, re-examining the photographs, trying to reconcile the man who had written "My True North" with the man who had complained about a chipped mug. At 12:30 p.m., the bell on the door chimed. A death knell. He walked in. Her heart didn't just hammer, it seized, a painful, violent clench in her chest. It wasn't just a rude customer anymore. It was him, the man who had abandoned her mother, the man whose blood ran in her veins. He took his seat at table 4. It was her section. There was no escape. Leo saw the look on her face. "I can take him," he mouthed from across the room. She shook her head. A strange, cold resolve washed over her. No, she had to do this. She had to face him, armed with this terrible, world-altering truth. She walked to his table, each step feeling like a mile. This time she wasn't just looking at a bully. She was looking for the ghost of the man from the photographs. The icy blue eyes were the same, but the fire in them had been banked, replaced by a glacial remoteness. The sharp jawline was harder now, set in a permanent line of dissatisfaction. "Good afternoon," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the usual forced warmth. He looked up, and for a split second their eyes met and held. A flicker of something crossed his face. Not recognition, but a faint, puzzled curiosity. She had dropped her mask. The pleasant, deferential waitress was gone, replaced by someone he didn't know. Her moss-green eyes, so like Isabella's, were not pleading or fearful. They were watching him, judging him. "The usual," he said. His voice clipped, and he turned to look out the window, dismissing her. But the interaction had changed. Every demand, every sigh of impatience was no longer the random cruelty of a stranger. It was a fresh abandonment. His complaint that his coffee was too bitter felt like a rejection of her very DNA. When she brought his steak sandwich, her hand was perfectly steady. As she set the plate down, a small, defiant thought entered her mind. She let her thumb brush, for a fraction of a second, against the edge of the plate. A tiny, insignificant act of rebellion. He saw it. He recoiled as if she had placed a spider on his plate. "Your thumb," he said, his voice sharp with disgust. It touched the plate. The words, so mundane, struck her with the force of a physical blow. Her thumb, her fingerprint, the genetic marker of his own child, right there on the edge of his perfect, sterile world. Something inside her, the part that had been screaming since she opened that box, finally went silent. It was replaced by a chilling, profound calm. She looked him directly in the eye. "My apologies," she said. Her voice was cold, crisp, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was a perfect mirror of his own. She turned on her heel and walked away. For the rest of his meal, she was a spectre. She did her job with a terrifying efficiency, but she did not speak to him. She refilled his coffee without being asked, her movements silent. She cleared his plate the moment he was finished. She was a presence, but she was no longer a person trying to please him. He noticed. She could feel his gaze following her as she moved through the diner. He was frowning. He was accustomed to her flustered attempts to meet his standards. This new, icy precision was different. It was a form of control, and it wasn't his. It unsettled him. When she dropped the check on his table, he looked up at her again, a question in his cold eyes. She met his gaze, her expression a blank wall. For a long, silent moment, the air crackled between them, thick with 23 years of unspoken history. Then he broke contact, signed the slip, and left. She walked to the table, her heart a cold stone. She didn't care about the tip. She was looking for the note. There it was. A distinct lack of effort today. She didn't crumple it. She folded it neatly, a small, sharp crease down the middle, and slipped it into her apron pocket. It was another piece of evidence. He had no idea how much effort she was expending just to keep from screaming. The weeks that followed were a tense, silent war. Ilara's service was impeccable and cold. Julian's scrutiny was relentless, but now it was tinged with a strange watchfulness. The power dynamic had shifted. She was no longer his victim. Armed with the secret, she felt like a spy in her own life, gathering intelligence on the man who had shaped her existence through his absence. But the emotional toll was devastating. Her grandmother's health was declining, and the nights were long and filled with worry. Her history books lay unopened. Her life felt suspended, trapped between a painful past she had just discovered and a future she couldn't see. The breaking point arrived on a cold, rain-lashed Tuesday. The Viridian was busier than usual, the lunchtime crowd seeking refuge from the storm. Julian Croft was at his usual table, but today he was not alone. He was flanked by two men in suits as severe as his own. On the table between them were rolled-up blueprints. Ilara's section was on the other side of the restaurant, but she couldn't help but watch. He was a different person in this context. He was commanding, his gestures sharp, his voice a low, authoritative hum. He was in his element. Then she heard a phrase that made the blood freeze in her veins. "Total demolition of the entire block," one of the men said, gesturing vaguely towards the window. "The Viridian, the old bookstore, the apartments above. All of it comes down for the Croft Tower." The apartment. The small, rent-controlled apartment where her grandmother lay sleeping. The only home Ilara had ever known. Julian Croft nodded, a flicker of a smile on his lips. "It's an antiquated block. Its time is past. We'll offer the residents a token relocation package, of course. A formality. A token." He was talking about destroying her home, her grandmother's home, and dismissing their lives as a formality. A white-hot rage, purer and more potent than anything she had ever felt, surged through her. It wasn't just about the letters, or the abandonment, or the years of insults. It was about this final, ultimate act of erasure. He wasn't just a bad father. He was a plague, a force of destruction that was about to swallow her world whole. She untied her apron, letting it fall to the floor. Leo saw her, his eyes wide. "Ellie, what are you doing?" She ignored him. She walked across the dining room, her steps steady and deliberate. The clatter of the diner seemed to fade away until the only sound was the furious pounding of her own heart. She stopped at table 4. The three men fell silent, looking up at her. "Is there a problem with the service?" Julian asked, his voice laced with icy annoyance at the interruption. "Yes," Ilara said, her voice shaking but dangerously clear. "There is. With you." His eyebrows shot up. The two suits exchanged an alarmed glance. "I beg your pardon?" "This block," she said, gesturing to the world outside the window. "You call it antiquated. You talk about demolishing it like you're taking out the trash. Do you have any idea what you're destroying?" He stared at her, utterly nonplussed. "I'm quite sure I do. It's called progress, young woman. You should look it up." "Progress?" Her laugh was a sharp, bitter sound. "You're planning to tear down the Orpheum building. It was designed by Lewis Garrick in 1928, one of the first steel frame structures in this city to incorporate Art Deco motifs. Its terracotta facade is irreplaceable. You think you can just replace it with another one of your glass and steel monstrosities?" Julian's expression shifted from annoyance to a flicker of genuine surprise. He was being lectured on architectural history by a waitress. "And this building," she continued, her voice rising, drawing the attention of the entire restaurant. "This diner. Before it was this, it was a bookstore. And before that, in the 70s, it was a community art gallery. A young, passionate artist, had her first and only showing here. Her name was Isabella Vance. The name landed in the air between them like a grenade. Julian Croft flinched. It was a minuscule reaction, a slight stiffening of his shoulders, a flicker in his frozen eyes. But Ilara saw it. She believed in preserving things, Ilara pressed on, her voice thick with emotion. She believed that a city's soul was in its history, in its old buildings. She fought people like you her whole life, people who only see dollar signs when they look at the world. She reached into the pocket of her jeans, her fingers closing around the worn brass compass she now carried with her everywhere. She pulled it out and slapped it down on the table, right next to the blueprints for the Croft Tower. It spun for a moment before settling, its needle pointing north. "She told me my father gave this to her," she said, her voice dropping to a raw, trembling whisper, "for his ears only. He called her his true north. He had it engraved on the back." Julian's gaze dropped to the compass. The blood drained from his face. He looked as if he had seen a ghost. He recognized it. "A man who gives a woman a compass and calls her his true north," Ilara said, her eyes burning with unshed tears, "doesn't grow up to be the kind of man who tears down her world for a buck. So you must not be him." She held his gaze for one last, shattering moment. She saw confusion, shock, and something that looked terrifyingly like dawning horror in his eyes. Then she turned her back on him, on the two stunned executives, on the silent, staring restaurant. She walked out the front door, not into the alley this time, but onto the main street, into the cold, cleansing rain. She was jobless. She was about to be homeless. She was utterly terrified, but for the first time in her life, she was not silent. She had spoken her history. She had defended her mother's legacy, and she had left Julian Croft to reckon with the ghost she had just raised in the middle of his perfect, well-ordered lunch. For a long time after she left, Julian Croft didn't move. The hushed whispers of the diner, the concerned looks from his associates, the rain streaking down the window, none of it penetrated the roaring silence in his head. His world, a meticulously constructed fortress of logic, control, and emotional detachment, had been breached. His eyes were fixed on the small brass compass lying on the table. My true north. 23 years ago, he had stood on a wind-swept pier with a fiery, passionate art student and given her that compass. Isabella Vance. A name he had systematically excised from his life, buried under decades of ruthless ambition. And the girl, the waitress, her moss-green eyes, her defiant spirit, her impossible knowledge. Her name was Isabella Vance. It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement of fact. He replayed the scene in his mind, every word, every nuance. The way she'd talked about the building's history, that was just knowledge. But the compass, the story, that was a secret known only to two people, one of whom was dead. "Julian, are you all right?" one of his associates, a man named Harris, asked tentatively. Julian blinked, slowly returning to the present. He picked up the compass. The brass was warm from her hand. He turned it over. The inscription was faded, but unmistakable. For Isabella, my true north. J. He felt a sudden, dizzying vertigo, as if the floor had dropped out from under him. He pushed his chair back abruptly, the legs scraping harshly against the floor. "The meeting is over," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "The project is on hold indefinitely." "On hold," Harris stammered. "But the permits, the investors—" "Did you not hear me?" Julian snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. He turned and strode out of the restaurant, leaving his bewildered team and a table full of abandoned plans behind him. He returned to his penthouse, a sterile sanctuary of glass and steel overlooking the city he had conquered. But now, the panoramic view felt like a monument to all he had lost. He sat in the suffocating silence, the compass clutched in his hand, and for the first time in over 2 decades, he allowed himself to remember Isabella. Her laugh, the smell of turpentine that always clung to her clothes, the fierce way she argued about art and politics and the soul of the city. The woman he had called a distraction. His first reaction was denial. It was a trick, a scam. The girl had somehow found the compass, researched his past, and was orchestrating an elaborate shakedown. It was the only logical explanation. He would not be a fool. He summoned his head of security, a formidable ex-FBI agent named Marcus Thorne. "I want you to find out everything there is to know about a young woman," Julian commanded, his voice cold and clipped, a desperate attempt to regain control. "Her name is Ilara Vance. She was a waitress at the Viridian. I want her history, her associates, her financials. I want to know where she got this." He placed the compass on his desk. "And I want it done yesterday." While Julian's world was imploding, Ilara's was in a state of terrified freefall. She had gone straight to her grandmother's apartment, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. She had to get her grandmother out of there, away from him. She found Mrs. Gable awake, watching an old black-and-white movie. "Ellie dear, you're home early," she said, her voice frail. "You look flushed." "Grandma," Ilara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We need to talk. We might have to move." Over the next 2 days, Ilara operated on pure adrenaline. She called in favors, found a small, temporary sublet in a neighboring borough through Leo's cousin, and began the heartbreaking process of packing up her grandmother's life, her mother's memories, her entire world. She was running on the assumption that an eviction notice from Croft Enterprises was imminent. The call came on the 3rd day. It wasn't from a lawyer. It was Marcus Thorne. His voice was professional, dispassionate. "Miss Vance, my name is Marcus Thorne. I represent Julian Croft. He has requested a meeting with you." "I have nothing to say to him," Ilara said, her voice trembling with anger. "He is prepared to offer a significant financial settlement to compensate you for your mother's legacy and to ensure your silence regarding your claims." The words were a slap in the face. A settlement? Silence. He thought he could buy her off, erase her and her mother with a check. "You tell Mr. Croft," she said, her voice. The ice in her voice was a shard of his own making, and when she hung up, the silence that followed was absolute. It was not the quiet of a penthouse insulated from the city below. It was the profound, airless silence of a tomb. Marcus Thorne relayed the final details, the birth certificate, the DNA confirmation. His voice a clinical drone that barely registered over the roaring in Julian's ears. 99.99%, a number that obliterated a lifetime of carefully constructed certainties. He had not been torturing a waitress. He had been systematically dismantling his own daughter. The realization did not come as a wave of guilt, but as a slow, horrifying suffocation. Each cruel word, each condescending glance, each dismissive note left on a receipt replayed in his mind, not as acts of casual tyranny, but as unforgivable sins against his own blood. He saw her tired, intelligent eyes, Isabella's eyes, and understood with sickening clarity that every time he had looked at her with contempt, he had been desecrating his own past. He had seen the ghost of the woman he'd abandoned, and without knowing it, had tried to exorcise it with cruelty. Isabella hadn't hidden Ilara from him as a punishment. She had hidden her as a protection. She had seen the man he was becoming, the man who would trade a compass for a blueprint, a soul for a skyline, and she had built a wall of silence around her child to keep the monster out. And she had been right. He had proven her right, over and over, every Tuesday and Thursday at 12:30 p.m. The city lights, once a glittering testament to his power, now seemed to mock him, each one a pinpoint of light in a vast, self-inflicted darkness. He had conquered this city, but he had lost his true north 23 years ago and had been adrift ever since. He found her building that evening, the rain slicking the pavement, mirroring the cold sheen of the towers that bore his name. There was no plan, no strategy. The magnate, the titan, the predator was gone, leaving only a man hollowed out by the truth. The notice of reletting taped to her apartment door was not just a piece of paper. It was a verdict. It was the physical evidence of his crime. Erasure. He had tried to erase a block of the city, and in doing so had erased the only family he had left. He pressed his hand against the cold wood of the door, a door he would never be invited to enter, and felt the full, crushing weight of an absence he had authored. It took Marcus another day to locate the sublet, a nondescript building in a borough Julian hadn't set foot in since his youth. This time, he went alone. The taxi ride felt like a journey into a foreign country, the familiar landscape of his success giving way to a world of brick and fire escapes, a world of lives lived in defiance of men like him. When he knocked, the door opened to reveal her. She was framed in the dim, warm light of the apartment, a sentinel guarding a fragile peace. The defiance was still in her eyes, but beneath it was a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that he knew, with a fresh stab of agony, was his doing. "What do you want?" she asked. Her voice was not the weapon it had been on the phone. It was a low, fractured whisper, the sound of a string stretched to its breaking point. He opened his mouth, but the carefully rehearsed words, the corporate-honed apologies, disintegrated. He was stripped of his armor, his language. "I know," he finally managed, the words raw and inadequate. It was a confession, not a statement. Her shoulders slumped, the last of her fight seeming to drain away, leaving a terrifying vulnerability in its place. "You know?" she repeated, her voice devoid of inflection. It was the flat tone of someone who had expected the worst and had not been disappointed. "So this is it? The part where you offer me a trust fund to disappear, a non-disclosure agreement so the unknown daughter doesn't tarnish the Croft brand." The transactional coldness of her words was a perfect reflection of the world he had built, and it shamed him to his core. "No," he said, his voice ragged. "No more transactions. I came to apologize." He forced himself to hold her gaze, to let her see the ruin she had wrought inside him. "For the diner, for the way I spoke to you, for every single word on every single receipt, for your home, for this displacement." He gestured helplessly at the unfamiliar hallway. "And for 23 years of silence I didn't even know I was keeping." Her laugh was a brittle, broken sound. "An apology? You think that word has any meaning now? An apology doesn't give my grandmother back the home she's lived in for 40 years. It doesn't undo the nights I spent awake, terrified, trying to figure out how to pay for her medicine. It doesn't give me back the mother who had to be strong enough for 2 people because you were busy building monuments to yourself." Her voice cracked on the last word, and the anger, righteous and incandescent, surged back. "Where were you when she was sick, Julian? Where were you when she was dying? Did you ever, even once, look at this city you own and wonder what happened to the woman you called your true north?" Each question was a physical blow. He had no defense, no answer, He could only stand there and absorb the full force of her pain, the pain he had both caused and been oblivious to. "I know," he whispered, the words tasting like ash. "I know it fixes nothing. I cancelled the tower project. Your building, your lease. It's all safe. I know it's a meaningless gesture now, but it's done." He looked past her, into the small living room, and saw an elderly woman in a wheelchair, her face etched with a familiar worry. Isabella's mother, the family he had turned his back on. But it's not about that. It's not about guilt or fixing things with money. It's about shame. In the diner, when you spoke her name, you held up a mirror and I saw a monster. I have spent my life acquiring things, Alara. Buildings, companies, power. And I am standing here now with nothing that matters. He took a half step forward, an involuntary movement of pleading. I don't expect forgiveness. God, I don't deserve it. I don't even know what I'm asking for. A chance, perhaps. Not to be a father. It's too late for that. But a chance to not be the man from the diner anymore. A chance to be someone Isabella wouldn't be ashamed of. The raw, unvarnished confession hung in the air between them. He saw the war in her eyes, the deep, instinctual hatred for the man who had tormented her, battling with the flicker of recognition for the broken man standing before her now. She was her mother's daughter, fierce and unforgiving, but she was also her mother's daughter, with a heart that had been forged in compassion. She said nothing. She simply looked at him for a long, unreadable moment, her moss-green eyes searching his for a truth he wasn't sure he possessed. Then, slowly, she closed the door, not slamming it, but shutting it with a quiet finality that was somehow more devastating. He stood in the empty hallway, listening to the click of the lock, a sound that sealed a lifetime of mistakes. It was not a beginning. It was a definitive and deserved end. For a week there was only silence. Julian did not call. He did not send emissaries. He honored the closed door. He existed in a state of purgatory, his penthouse a prison of his own design. He had Marcus find every piece of information he could on Isabella's later life. He read about her quiet activism, her part-time work at a community library, the small, anonymous life she had lived. He found a grainy photo online from a local newspaper article about a library bake sale. In it, Isabella was laughing, a smudge of flour on her cheek, and beside her was a little girl with a gap-toothed smile and her mother's eyes. His daughter. He stared at the photo for hours, a portrait of a life he had been completely absent from, a joy he had never known. His first move was not toward Ilara, but toward her history. He dispatched a team of art restorers and private archivists, not to her, but to the city's dusty storage vaults and the homes of aging artists. 2 weeks after he had stood at her door, a courier delivered a flat, rectangular package to her apartment. Inside, Ilara found no letter, no explanation, only a single, beautifully framed photograph. It was a professional shot of a young, vibrant Isabella, standing proudly beside a large, chaotic, brilliant painting of a cityscape at dawn. It was the painting from her first and only gallery show. Tucked into the back of the frame was the original, yellowed brochure from that show. Isabella Vance, featured artist. He hadn't sent an apology. He had sent a resurrection. He had given her back a piece of her mother she never knew she had lost, a testament to the fiery, talented woman who existed before the quiet, weary mother. It was an act of profound understanding. He was not trying to insert himself into her life, but to restore a part of hers that he had, by his absence, helped to diminish. It was she who made the next move. She sent him a single typed line via email. The Historical Society Archives. Saturday, 2 p.m. He arrived early, his heart pounding with a nervous energy he hadn't felt since he was a young man trying to secure his first loan. The archives were quiet, filled with the hushed reverence of the past and the dry, sweet scent of decaying paper. It was her territory, a world of history and substance, the antithesis of his own. She was waiting for him at a long oak table, surrounded by stacks of books. She looked different here, more herself. Not the harried waitress or the defiant guardian, but a scholar, at home, among the ghosts of the city. The silence was thick with 23 years of unspoken words. He broke it, his voice softer than he intended. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." "I'm not here for you," she said, her voice cool and level, though she wouldn't meet his eyes. "I'm here for her." She gestured to the photograph, which sat on the table between them like a silent mediator. "Where did you find it?" I remembered the name of the gallery owner. He retired to Florida, but his daughter had his old records. The painting itself. It was sold to a private collector who died years ago. It's in a storage unit in Delaware. I'm having it brought back. He paused. "It belongs to you." She finally looked at him, and he saw the flicker of emotion she was trying so hard to suppress. "Why are you doing this, Julian?" "Because it's all I can do," he said simply. "I can't give you back time. I can't undo what I did. All I can do is try to find the pieces of her I helped bury." He slid a thick, leather-bound book across the table. It was a portfolio of high-resolution photographs. "These are from her sketchbooks. The gallery owner's daughter had them. There, mostly of the city. Old buildings. Details you'd never notice." Tentatively, she opened the book. Page after page was filled with Isabella's drawings, the intricate terracotta work on the Orpheum building, the iron gates of a forgotten cemetery, the face of a homeless man sketched with heartbreaking empathy. It was her mother's soul, laid bare on the page. In seeing the city through Isabella's eyes, Ilara was also seeing it through his. This was the city they had both loved, the city he had forgotten how to see. "She used to say," Ilara whispered, her fingers tracing the drawing of a gargoyle, "that you can't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been." She meant it about history, about cities. "She was right," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. "I spent my whole life looking forward to the next deal, the next tower. I never looked back. Until you." In that quiet, dusty room, surrounded by the recorded lives of strangers, they began the slow, painful work of archaeology on their own history. It was not a conversation between a father and a daughter. It was a dialogue between two custodians of a shared, beloved memory. He told her stories of Isabella the activist, the girl who chained herself to a fountain to save it from demolition. She, in turn, told him of Isabella the mother, the woman who could make a magical world out of a cardboard box and who sang Italian lullabies to chase away nightmares. They were filling in the blanks for each other, creating a more complete picture of the woman who connected them. His transformation was not a miracle. It was a demolition. The ruthless magnate was slowly, painstakingly dismantled, and in his place, something new was being built. He established the Isabella Vance Preservation Trust, endowing it with a fortune that stunned the philanthropic world. Its sole mission was to save the city's architectural soul from men like him. He didn't offer Ilara a handout, he offered her a job. He asked her to serve as the trust's chief historian, a position created for her, based on the academic credentials he knew she would one day complete. He re-enrolled her at the university, funding her education through a blind trust so it would not feel like a gift from him. It was a purpose, a future, built upon the foundation of her own passion. Their relationship found its footing not in grand emotional gestures, but in the shared work of the trust. Their meetings were about zoning laws and historical designations, but beneath the professional language, a different conversation was taking place. He was learning her world, the world of context and meaning. She was learning his, the world of leverage and power, and was teaching him how to wield it for preservation instead of profit. 1 year to the day after she had walked out of the Viridian, they stood on the sidewalk across from the Orpheum building. Scaffolding encased its magnificent facade, and the sounds of careful restoration work filled the air. The project was the Trust's first major victory. "She would have picketed my office for a month to get this done," Julian said, a wry, sad smile touching his lips. "She would have called me a soulless capitalist. And then, when I finally gave in, she would have kissed me on the steps of this very building." Elara looked from the building to him, and for the first time, she smiled a true, unguarded smile. "She would have been furious it was in danger in the first place, and she would have made you pay for the celebratory dinner." They shared a moment of laughter, a fragile, precious sound that bridged the chasm between them. It was a joke born of a shared understanding of the woman they had both loved and lost. He reached into his coat pocket. He held out the brass compass. It had been restored, its surface gleaming, the inscription on the back clear and sharp. "I think this belongs with its new true north," he said quietly. "You saved more than just a building, Elara. You reminded me which way to look." She took it from him, the weight of it familiar and solid in her palm. It was no longer a symbol of abandonment, but a testament to resilience. It was a legacy she had not inherited, but earned. She didn't call him Dad. He didn't call her daughter. The wounds were too deep, the lost years an uncrossable ocean. But as they stood together, two architects of a fragile and uncertain future, they were no longer defined by the silence that had separated them. They were defined by the history they had chosen, finally, to build together.